would be really advantageous to be able to put a little tiny house in my backyard for my mother-in-law,
or for when your wife kicks you out of the house.
It happens all the time. So sorry, Jeff.
Yeah, I mean, you're hitting the nail right on the head there.
PowerPoints, power lunches, conference calls, reply to all, endless meetings, constant check-ins, and so much wasted time. Are you sick of the BS? So are we. It's time to take our time back, rework the way we work, and make every call a call to action. This is a podcast for people who want to stop talking and really start connecting. This is After 12. Hi, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to After 12. 12 for 12's original podcast series that explores cool companies, brands, messages, and makers, and what compels us to take notice and become fans. As always, I'm joined by my creative co-host and life partner, Josh Rush. We've got a great show for you today. Our guest today is a professional skier, contractor, and co-host of FYI Network's Tiny House Nation. When he and co-host John Weisbarth are traveling the country, designing and building tiny homes, Zack is a professional speaker, sharing his love for tiny dwellings and tiny home living. In addition, he owns and operates his own company called Zack Rabbit Tools and Accessories. Internet, please join me in welcoming Zack Giffin to After 12. Zack, welcome.
Hey guys. Happy to be here with you.
Happy to have you here, man. It's great to have you on the show. It sounds like you've been keeping really busy. How have you guys been doing in the quarantine zone?
For me, it's actually been something I've been kind of really enjoying, just because I've been looking forward to a time in my life where I get to stay in one place for a bit. I've been kind of, even before the Tiny House television show, being a skier, I was constantly on the road, traveling more internationally. And I was kind of feeling like I could use some routine in my life even then. And then I got hired on the show, and just 6 years later, it's like no hope. So this has been, it's of course it's a challenge, but it's also a blessing.
Well, it must be nice to get some time to hang out in that mansion that you're living in.
Well, I'm going to be honest, like I get interviewed quite a bit, and very rarely do people kind of ask for me like, hey, what's your bio? They just grab it off the internet, and like, I've been doing this a long time. So I'm pretty sure a lot of the stuff that people get is legitimately like the very first bio that was ever written for me and put online, which was like 2014. And, a lot has happened since then, but
sure.
Yeah, it's always fun to kind of hear where people think I am. I actually do live in a very small space, but I got married about 2 years ago, and in the fall we moved to Glacier, and I'm renting a 1-bedroom apartment in a little condo up there, and that's where we've been living for the last year and a half. But it's for a whole lot of different reasons. And one of the big ones is that, it's not exactly legal to live in a tiny house anywhere, right? Especially when you're on wheels. So you have to take that into consideration. And I'm somebody who, I believe that every movement needs kind of all types of activists. And for a long time, I was kind of a renegade activist, right? So I was living a little bit, I call under the radar. Other people might call it illegally, but
my dad calls it don't be a ski bum, son. Get a job. Yeah. Well, it's funny though. I mean, Josh and I have spent so much time when we're not podcasting, philosophically discussing, quarantine and assessing how we live and how to live simpler. And by reducing kind of the daily complexity, we increase the quality of life. I mean, was this pursuit of simple living a big part of what attracted you to build your first tiny home?
Well, I mean, Adam, a bit about the ski culture for sure. And some people kind of hear that I come from skiing background, and they're like, well, that's so weird. How did you make that jump? And actually, if you know about the culture, it's really not that much of a stretch, because the whole idea of minimalism, this idea that we're kind of prioritizing the experiences in our life over the material possessions, is nothing new within that culture. Not just skiing, but kind of all outdoor sports, rock climbing, surfing. You all kind of have this mentality of like, the individual that kind of sacrifices some of those, society's comforts to pursue the sport on a high level is almost like a badge of honor within that culture.
So how does that now, thinking about just spending the last 3 months indoors, how's the culture faring?
I would just kind of say that I have heard a lot of people saying, like, I wonder what the tiny house people think about their decision now, I guarantee. Yeah. My house, what worked for me was that my whole life was outdoors.
Yeah.
And it was such a small space, but it was that reassurance I needed in my life to be able to be brave enough to take risks, because I always had a place to come back to. But it only really worked because I wasn't spending 8 hours a day there. And I guess that being said, I just kind of feel like, yeah, it is a challenge to live in a tiny house if you have to stay indoors all the time. Absolutely. However, I think that discounts a lot of the contentment people have from having a space that they feel secure in, where the payments aren't such a stress on their life. Because right now we're living in a situation where so many people are in their homes for the first time because they're always outside working to pay for these large homes. Now they're finally getting to enjoy it, but the bills are stacking up.
Yeah.
For a lot of people, their economic reality is no longer as certain as it was. And even though they got plenty of space to live in, they're looking at that space as like, oh my goodness, how am I going to pay for it?
It's a crushing weight.
Well, not only that, but
to hold up. Yeah.
We don't celebrate minimalism in the United States. We celebrate excess. And I think, COVID-19, or just the result of having, a pandemic that was really only precedented once in 1918, is now affecting us in the way we look at kind of, what is financial freedom? What is, environmental footprinting mean? What does our carbon footprint mean? And then what is our kind of our spiritual or our human connection with nature? And I've seen a lot of people just say, screw it, I want to change, from this experience. Is it now for you kind of like a vindication or justification of like what you and John have been doing the last 6 years?
Yeah, I would say that it's happening really very fast right now, but it's been gradually happening more and more over the last 2 decades. And 2008 was this big moment where it kind of was a reality check for a lot of people. A lot of people lost everything they had and got kind of disillusioned with the path that they had been told, where if you just, if you do everything right and you play the game, like it's going to work out. And so now I think that, yeah, we're in a new situation where it's starting to kind of make people kind of question, okay, like how sustainable was that path that I was on? And
also how gratifying was it really?
Yeah.
I think there's been a lot of time spent, Adam and I talk about this where like, I want to say, everybody says, well, you really just take this time and, just appreciate the time you have with your family. And to your point, Zach, it's like, well, yeah, but I have these bills to pay. Like, I've lost my job, my business is ruined, and, I'm stressed out still. It's like I went from being stressed to like more stress. There's no happiness.
Now I'm an alcoholic.
Well, I think it really comes down to like balance. When we're talking about what the goal of minimalism is, nobody's trying to say, hey, it's just better to be naked and like, eating with your fingernails. This is not, it's about, hey, finding that balance in your life, and it's different for everybody. Yeah. But there is a moment where like the tools that we need for happiness are sufficient. And we collect stuff beyond that ends up really being something that kind of holds us back, whether it's in our life and we don't know what to do, or if it's an expense that we think that we have to cover that we really don't, that requires us to work for it. But it's not about just pulling all stuff back. It's about like reflecting on what that balance is.
Is it strange to you that the inflection point for this change in addressing the human condition is a national or global pandemic? It's like, it takes that to, start a movement?
Not at all. It's not at all surprising that it takes like a real serious challenge for people to start looking at actually changing, because change is scared when people get complacent and happy, and like any sort of change is a little bit frightening. So it really usually does take an unavoidable challenge. And I would say climate change was already hitting us for a long time. 2 decades we've been aware about this.
Yeah.
So it's already been there. Then the financial crisis in 2008 kind of started making people question, is the structure, the way that we finance housing, the way that we invest in housing, is this something that's like serving us, and is it a sustainable process?
Well, let's talk about that.
Well, in my belief, it was that investment mentality, that drive to use our homes to build wealth.
Yeah. And
how it got set up where there was just so much incentive for a homeowner to basically use every spare bit of cash available to them to pour it into their home, to expand the size of the home, because it was all looked at as just a great investment. And because of the rate of appreciation that our housing was in and has been, that has really been facilitated by like interest rates and lending practices. Yeah. It really was a great investment. So you can't blame anybody for pouring their life savings back into their homes. Only problem is it's left us with a country where our housing stock has gotten bigger and bigger. We have more and more of our population living as single individuals, just in large homes that it's so obvious they don't need. And too much of our population is looking at their housing as their retirement plan.
Right. They have all of their money in their home. And I'd imagine that the generations that are coming up now, millennials and Gen Zs, won't have the financial ability to take that surplus of homes that are owned by, baby boomers now, like my parents, and buy those homes at the price they want to sell those homes for, with the appreciation on those homes.
That's exactly right. There's actually a really interesting study that was put out, and this was by Fannie Mae, right? So it's not a conspiracy website or anything. It's a report by Fannie Mae, and it was a project with a professor at USC, and it's called The Coming Exodus of Older Homeowners. And if anybody's interested in this subject, I totally recommend looking it up. And it says exactly what you just said. It said, okay, we have the baby boomers in our baby boomers own 2/5 of the housing in our country. And then people older than that demographic own another 1/5. So 60% of the housing in our country is owned by people 55 and older. Wow. And they are definitely the larger, more expensive homes. And just the net worth of the homes only owned by baby boomers is like $13.5 trillion. Wow. And what this report was really kind of doing was looking at the attrition rates. Attrition being like, somebody having to sell their home by something that is not within their control, whether that's like a drastic change in finances, it's a health emergency, it's death. All of those things are counted in attrition. And as you can understand, the rate of attrition when you're in your 60s, 70s, and 80s is different. Right. And that attrition rate has stayed steady for decades and decades. And it's what insurance companies use to kind of make their calculations on how much they need to charge. So basically, if you take that historic attrition rate and you apply it to this large population of homeowners, you basically have an unavoidable flood of homes being put on the market between now and 2026. And then again, it increases again after that. So anyways, I was just talking a lot, but it's basically reinforcing what you're saying, which is the younger generations mathematically do not have the asset holdings required to absorb that wealth.
Well, just in general, if you look at, the increase in cost of housing as it relates to cost of living over the last 30 years, right? I mean, you see median income, right, has stayed fairly steady, right? $60,000 a year, something like this for the last 30 years. And meanwhile, you watch home prices rise against it to, $300,000-$400,000 is sort of your median home value now. And it's like and really it's just because of the financial tools that are available to us that weren't available then, which is more or less,
And now, on top of that, millennials and Gen Zs are spending all their money on marijuana stocks. So it's really No, but there is good news. There's good news because according to the Boston Globe, RV sales and tiny houses are skyrocketing during the pandemic. Likewise, according to Curbed Atlanta, coronavirus is on pace for a 150% increase in accessory dwelling unit sales this year. Are you seeing the same trend? Are you and John talking about this trend? I know that you're the vice president of THIA, the Tiny House Industry Association. Are you guys talking about it in the association?
Oh, 100%. You know, that is our entire goal as an association, is try to really bring some unity to the industry, and then really push for unified building standards so that we can get more municipalities to open up to tiny homes. Because what you just said is a really interesting thing, because you're saying tiny homes and RVs are skyrocketing. Well, most tiny homes, when they're built by a tiny home builder, it's actually built as an RV, right? So in the code structure of the recreational vehicles, it says not intended for full-time use.
Yeah.
So right there in the code structure, the RV industry does not want their products to be lived in full-time. This is supposed to be a recreational vehicle. It's supposed to be for, you know, part-time vacations and this and that. And then they make park models, which are basically supposed to be second homes, but still they're not really intended for full-time use. There's no reason that they can't, but it's in the code structure. And so it makes it very difficult for cities to say, sure, go ahead and use a tiny home that's built as an RV as your house. Does that make sense?
And that's happening right now in California. Let's talk about that.
Yeah. So there are a few cities that actually have gone through with really important progressive legislation, basically enabling tiny homes to be used in backyards as an ADU. So you mentioned accessory dwelling units.
Yeah.
Accessory dwelling units is basically a foundation.
Okay.
Well, I mean, if you think about what you just said too, with regards to the Fannie Mae study, if you've got baby boomers and older over the next, 10 to 15 years are going to be flooded. They're going to be getting out of their homes and moving into some other form of scaled back and or assisted living. When you pair that reality with the new economic sort of realities that COVID is creating for much of the population, it seems to me like, it would be really advantageous to be able to put a little tiny house in my backyard for my mother-in-law,
or for when your wife kicks you out of the house.
It happens all the time. So sorry, Jeff.
Yeah. I mean, you're hitting the nail right on the head there. And I say we also have another factor here, which is that people already wanted to age in place. That's a really big desire.
Yeah.
Right now, after COVID, nobody wants to go to a nursing home or assisted living. Are you kidding?
Nursing home sales are down.
We're not going to a home, Suze.
Yeah. So that desire to create pathways for older homeowners to stay in their home and age in place is going to be really, really strong, as if it wasn't already really strong.
Yeah.
And there's a really interesting thing about ADUs, because an ADU is a terrific way for somebody to do that. You build a little cottage in your backyard. You can move into it. You stay in the community. You can rent out your home to somebody who needs the space. It also creates this amazing potential for a dynamic between an older and younger generation to kind of, one person has the property, one person has the body that can do the maintenance. It's a symbiotic relationship that's worked for millennial and human history.
Well, there's also wisdom exchange and experience exchange and grandparents having direct access to their grandkids. And, I think the way the Japanese, for instance, they revere and they protect their aging populations. We in the United States, we put them out to pasture. I mean, I think culturally what's happening and what you're seeing, is probably the linchpin of your marketing plan to go to nursing homes and try to attract these guys back to their families. But yeah, I think there is a major cultural reason that we're seeing that.
Yeah. And I would back you up on saying that I think it's healthy. I think it's really healthy for kids to grow up in a space where there's old people around, where they get to relate to old people. There's not this like barrier from interaction where the only time we see old people is like quarantined into these spaces. My parents, my grandma had Alzheimer's, and I watched my mom and my aunt take care of her for like 11 years. And it was super hard on the family. It was super hard on my parents, but for the education, the spiritual education of the kids, like myself, my brothers, to like witness that. I think it's really powerful.
So right now in the U.S., we're kind of dealing with dual pandemics. One on the sense of COVID-19 and what's happened with the virus infection, but the other on the sense of like coming to terms with prejudice and racial injustice here in the United States. How can tiny homes, and I mean this in a very serious question, like how can tiny homes help mitigate the effects of both?
Well, I'm really appreciate you asking that question. It's something that's really kind of fuels the passion that I have for tiny homes. Really on the next level is that I really believe that it's a way where by empowering lower income human beings in our society to actually have dignified housing, it's kind of like we talk about housing as this like way to build wealth, almost like a ladder, like it's a rung on a ladder, and you have all these different, kind of rungs on that ladder, and eventually you climb yourself up into a mansion. That's kind of like the American dream, right? But we're climbing on a ladder right now where some of the rungs are missing, right? Yeah. So if you are renting an apartment, to go from rental to home ownership at this point there's this huge gap. And you almost have to be like assisted by people like the friends that I have that are buying homes nowadays that are my age. They're basically getting their parents to co-sign on mortgages. Yeah. And that's how they're being able to do it, because people in my generation don't have the asset holdings to be able to qualify for mortgages. So if you come from a community where nobody even has the ability to like even co-sign on a loan to give you a chance and trust you, that really becomes a major gap. Furthermore, I believe that it's not just about creating affordable housing. What I really am passionate about is disrupting the process that ends up dividing our communities based on economic lines, if that makes sense.
Totally.
And what does that look? And what does that look like? What does that look like to you? I mean, Adam and I talk about this all the time, so I'm just curious.
Yeah. Well, we talk a lot about like the systemic inequalities, and that our system is kind of reinforcing these laws that hold people back and hold communities back. And I would say that the most obvious example of that kind of laws that we reinforce and that hold communities back are our zoning policies, right? Yeah. And if you go back to when they were implemented, I think I might be kind of breaking up a little bit. But basically, if you go back to the origins of those laws, it's very, very easy to trace them that they were implemented on for racial reasons, to hold minorities back. And we still are living with the same things. And it's just very convenient. People have changed the conversation from saying, hey, we're going to not allow people of this skin color into our community. We just say, hey, we're not going to allow people of low economic spectrum into our community. And by doing so, that's exactly what happens. We create just as segregated societies.
Well, John Oliver just did a piece this week on that same phenomenon. And it's amazing to me when you have a society that has a lack of affordable housing, and they are zoned in areas that have a lack of taxable income to be put towards schools or to be put towards infrastructure, you get the situation that we're in now. And so many of the values of minimalism or tiny house living is that you're not spending more than a third of your income of what you can earn on your home. And right now, I would say that for a lot of Americans, they're spending half of what they earn on their mortgage payments or their rent every month. And that is not sustainable. And if you can't, again, and then we've got the healthcare conundrum, and you've got, basic, food and utility servicing. You get to a tipping point, which is kind of where we are, especially when for 90 days you are out of work because you're a gig worker and there's a virus ripping through the community. Yeah. Tell us, in what you guys are doing at Thea, and also tell us about what you're doing at Operation Tiny Home, because this is a direct empowerment program that you guys have.
Yeah. Okay. I just want to comment one before we move on from the segregation aspect. I just want to say that, it's not like I'm advocating, all right, tiny homes is the solution, and all we need to do is have people who are oppressed move into these tiny little homes. And because that sounds like that's like an underhanded solution, right? This is not what I'm talking about. It's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is that we need more integrated societies. Right? We need more actually integrated societies so human beings can learn to interact with each other, become friends with each other. We need our children growing up together, learning how to be on soccer teams together and look past the aspect of skin color and just see the human. And I think we know how that happens, but it doesn't happen overnight. It requires people being intermixed. And the reason that I say that tiny homes is a really valuable tool is that we need solutions that can be implemented into the existing infrastructure that we have.
Yeah.
It's not like we can just start over and build new cities and do it in a conscious way where there's space for everybody.
Well, tiny homes too, as a niche kind of building opportunity, is creating communities. I saw that you went to a tiny home community in Portland where there's clusters of tiny homes. That kind of grassroots activism towards like building more community with these small dwellings. That makes a lot of sense. And
that leads right into your question about Operation Tiny Home, because Operation Tiny Home is a nonprofit that I really got involved with in 2015. And the whole goal is trying to kind of highlight the value that small communities of tiny homes can bring to different populations, but we started out and focused with veterans, right? Mm-hmm. Without kind of getting long-winded about it, what I believe is that the entire process, like looking at it as not just a home over your head, but a dignified space with also giving access to socialization and just a normal style of life, is kind of like preventative medicine for mental health.
Mm-hmm. It's better than the booze.
Yeah,
well, that was that. There was that
too, but
It was that study that I was telling you about, Adam, that I read. It came out of it was done in Utah, and they were looking at sort of the impacts on morbidity, and what had the highest impacts or direct relation to increased rates of morbidity. And exercise, like what you ate was number 10 on the list of 10 things. How much you exercise was right behind it. Smoking and drinking were in the middle, right? So with excess comes all bad things. But the number one and number two, I guess variables that increase morbidity were, how many people could you say you could rely on? If you were in a serious, issue, or if I had a problem, how many people could I call right now and get help from that problem? And the other variable was, how many people do you interact with on any given day? And people with greater social, kind of interactions and sense of community, live longer. In this study, and this is like, they followed people for 10 years or 15 years. It was really, really fascinating. So it's interesting to hear you say that. And the word community keeps coming up as you're talking about this, because I have some other questions about tiny homes as like vacation as a lifestyle, and how do you create community for that? But really thinking more about how to integrate tiny homes into current, kind of communities is really kind of, it's fascinating, because, it's why I live where I live, because we like the community. We have, common values, we all want the same things for our families, more or less. So how to integrate that, I'm really curious to hear, if you've got thoughts specific about what does that look like? Not just inner city, but, obviously suburban, seems to be a better place to try and make something like that work.
Yeah. Well, you hit on some really good things, and I'll try to respond to each one, but basically that sense of community, and what you were talking about with people's lives and how long people live, it's essentially stress. And as such a tribal species, one of the most stressful things that can happen to a person is isolation and lack of community, right? And the way that we design our cities absolutely has something to do with that. But I guess just in terms of what we do with veterans, that's a really big piece of it, right? Is trying to say, all right, every single one of these people that we work with has some kind of trauma that they're responding from. And PTSD is a huge piece of it. And when you really look in towards PTSD, you'll find that losing your kind of tribal support system in itself is a massive trauma to people, right? As people, like you just said, it's so important having friends, having connections, having that support. When you lose that, it's really emotionally damaging. Yeah. And it can contribute to a huge amount of the really like far off the spectrum levels of PTSD. So simply getting people back into a comfortable space, and as veterans, people that are so accustomed to kind of like that, hey, power in numbers, we're all here together. Yeah. It's a really important thing. And I've seen it do amazing things for people. It's like that next step, it's like, sure, you get them into a house, right? But then you want to make that house dignified. So you got to get the quality up so that they can at least feel good about themselves. I want especially a lot of these guys are young men, coming back from overseas. They've been surrounded by other men. And if they can't go out into the world, meet the girl of their dreams or the boy of their dreams, invite them back to their house, and then have some level of like pride of like, hey, this is my space. Yeah. That's a really emotionally damaging thing. So I want everybody to be at least proud of their little space, even if it's small. It's nice and it's dignified, but then we're not putting them out into a field. We're giving them access to other contact with other people that can kind of relate and get it and understand. Yeah, and I think,
hey, Zach, in addition to the community, how important is mobility to tiny homes? I mean, like what percentage of tiny homes are built and then kind of landlocked versus, put on trailers and taken to different locations?
Well, the percentage I would say with the demand is probably 95% on trailers, 5% on foundations. That's only being said because a lot of tiny homes on foundations are just getting built in backyards as ADUs, and they call them like my little backyard cottage. They're not saying like I'm building a tiny house, right? Yeah. And the mobility is a massive factor, and it goes right into another thing that you were saying, which was implementation. Okay. So ADUs are extremely popular. It's essentially like a tiny home, only it's non-movable. So it has to be built on a fixed foundation. And what that means is that the entire burden of the upfront cost falls onto the property owner.
Okay. Gotcha. All right. And they have to be built on the location, which causes noise and permitting, and your neighbors hate you for a week or a month.
That's huge. That's huge. But for the most part, the limitation is that financial burden. And what it means is that in places that have gone through with ADUs, it's extremely disappointing levels of the ADUs actually make it onto the rental market. They're being built, but they're getting built to kind of pad out the equity of somebody's property. Now you got a cool guest house. You can rent it on VRBO, and they're not going to long term. So it's not actually affecting the affordability. Gotcha. Now, the flip side is having something that's allowed to be non-permanent, and you could be on wheels. It can be craned in, doesn't matter, but simply being non-permanent means that the upfront cost can be divided. So say you have a property, and you're like millions of other Americans in the country where you're kind of treading water financially, right? You got this property, you don't want to move, but you don't have the amount of, you can't completely retire. You can basically say yes to someone like myself and my wife who could afford to buy a tiny home. We get that dignity of like owning our space, and we can simply rent out your backyard. Yeah. And then the cost of connecting the utilities is, maybe 10 grand. Yeah. And you can start making an income without having this massive upfront cost. And then it also provides an opportunity for someone like me to start feeling like I have some ownership of something.
Right. Yeah. That's really smart. I mean, think about too, like, how much we've proffered from the sharing economy, and really how much space you have in your backyard that goes unaccounted for. It's not being used. It's not being shared. That's really smart.
Well, and we have such an incentive to look at ways to increase the density within our cities and do it in a way that doesn't disrupt the harmony of what we love about the neighborhoods.
Yeah.
And you had mentioned, Adam, the construction issue of building an ADU. And heck yeah, look at that other advantage of mobility. If I can build something in an off-site controlled environment, I can build it more efficiently to higher quality standards with less construction waste and give you a product at lower cost.
Yep.
And that means, in addition, instead of like me and my buddies showing up to your neighborhood and dominating the space for 2 months and pissing off your neighbors, we're going to roll in with a crane and in one day drop it into place. Then you got like 2 other days of hooking up the utilities. And it's just so much less
less porta potties.
Yeah. But Zach, you gotta shoot us straight here, because we had Chip Wade on a couple weeks ago. Chip's a great friend of ours and of the firm, and he was on HGTV, and so we know a little bit about how these shows go with regards to the budget and how things actually get built. So break it down for us, right? I mean, is it really as affordable as the show would lead me to believe, that I could have this tiny house for, $25,000, $30,000? Or how does it really fit with regards to construction, materials, labor? Like what really is the true cost of a small, tiny house?
Okay. Yeah, that's a really good question. Our show, I don't know much about reality TV, but I know that our show is pretty damn real. Like the workload is super real. I'm like going late nights all the time. I mean, we're on deadlines. But there are, 2 things that are commonly not exactly being upfront about. And number one is the time frame, because we always have the time frame, but we always blame it on something else besides the fact that it's just like, this is what has to happen in order for like it to be profitable, to do the TV show.
Yeah, we'll get it to the 80% mark as long as the camera doesn't see what isn't finished. We're happy, right?
Yeah,
exactly. Well, we actually try really hard not to do that, not to make it just camera ready. And what I will say is that in the very beginning, the producers of the show really had no real idea of how much it was costing us to build the homes. Like things were just not getting kept track of. They knew how much they were charging the homeowner, and they would take that number and put it on television. And our cost was always way above that, right? And you're getting donated material and stuff that's not even being counted. And so the one big disservice I think we did of the industry in the very beginning was our show started quoting numbers that were very unrealistic. And then other people online were also doing homes for unrealistic budgets. And it meant that when people started really getting into it and then going down to the point of like, hey, maybe I want to get, they got kind of like slapped in the face with reality. Was that necessary in the beginning? Like the producers probably thought it was, to like give people the fantasy, maybe. But I've never felt like that was a contributing thing to the movement.
Yeah.
Well, Zach, how can our listeners find out more about the movement? How can they learn more about tiny homes?
Well, if they're on social media, there's an amazing array of kind of people that are out there. There's the Tiny Home Industry Association. We have a Facebook page that is very updated, that is really trying to be like a news source about kind of what is happening out there in the whole landscape of tiny homes and housing. There's the American Tiny House Association, and both of those two are kind of like the main representatives of people that are trying to support the movement. A good way to be a supporter is to go and be a member of them. And it costs like $25 a year. That money goes into helping really, pay for the conversations to be, we have in the United Tiny Home Association, we have, or the industry association, our president has been really in every single meeting, that had real change and progress happened. Like our president was there articulating it, and just to be able to pay for him to like actually make those appearances is really, really powerful, because he is just he's a rock star in this. And then just the other thing that people can do is just be aware of what's happening. And what I mean by that, there's this really amazing trend that's happening in Los Angeles has kind of started it, where they made tiny homes in the backyards legal to be used as ADUs, just like what we're talking about, providing this really powerful tool that is accessible to the people that need it most. It's not a tool that just enables developers to like make more affordable housing and keep lining their pockets. It's something that is legitimately a tool that human beings, or like people, average people, can have access to.
That's really cool.
And that's an important distinction. So San Jose, which is, I think, top 10, one of the largest cities, and I think the most expensive city in our country.
And my hometown.
They actually just,
right?
Well, yeah. They just became the second major city in the country to adopt it, right?
Wow.
Now the same process. Denver is considering it. This is a policy that can really, it can enable affordable housing to be created by individuals without using federal funding. It's something that Ben Carson and conservatives are all about, because it's a classic deregulation of the private sector and enabling us to provide solutions
and jobs. Right?
Yeah. And then, in terms of libertarians, it's it's about allowing property owners like self-determination to how to use their property to facilitate their home. It's self-determination to say, hey, I want to live in something on wheels. I'm an American. I should be able to do that.
Right.
And then as far as kind of the liberal-minded people out there, I mean, we got to change around our society to a less impactful, energy consumptive way to live. And we need to look for tools for that. This is about affordable housing. It's about reining in our energy use. And the, kind of the liberal base is 100% for it too. So it's a remarkable thing that we can make an impact with just a swipe of the pen.
Well, Zack,
it's not how often we find that.
You are definitely helping the cause and making an impact. First and foremost, congrats on 6 years of Tiny House Nation and the upcoming season, which when production opens up, I'm sure you'll be on the road again soon. Congratulations on all you guys are doing with, Operation Tiny House or Tiny Home and helping the veterans. And then, keep doing what you're doing with Thea and fighting the good fight. And lastly, but most important, thanks for being on the show today.
Absolutely. Yeah,
really appreciate your time. And if you
I
want to learn,
really appreciate being here.
I was going to say, if you want to learn more about tiny homes, again, you said the Tiny Home Industry Association Facebook page. That's where to go.
That's a great resource. American Tiny Home Association, but also just looking up tiny home groups in your own area is the best way to get information about what's allowed and what's not allowed, who's building what's available right in your area. Just look up, okay, I'm in Bellingham. There's a Bellingham or a Washington tiny house Facebook group. Go up, join it. And thanks again. And if you want a great tool, you can go to zackrabbit.com and check out the coolest tool in woodworking.
Yes. And you can build your own tiny home with this
manufacturing.
Well, Zack, thank you again for being on the show. And I think Josh and I are going to move into a tiny home soon.